Everyone, and welcome to the Identity Politics introduction. So, this is meant to introduce you to the theme, and a lot of the content I'm going to be speaking about here is something that I want you guys to use as a baseline and as a springboard for the rest of the content that we're going to have. So, next week, we're going to have a conversation about the African diaspora. I want you to use a lot of the theory that we have discussed in this lecture as a guideline to understand how to approach debates, ideas, and theories around the African diaspora. When we talk about feminism, I want you to apply the same thing. When we talk about the LGBTQIA plus community, I also want you to apply the same thing. So that's what this particular video is intended for. So, give you some context on where I'm at. It's 11 p.m. at night when I'm recording this. I recorded the rebuttal video not so long ago, I think about 20 minutes ago. It's currently uploading. So I'm just gonna sip my tea and I'm gonna run through this session. Fun fact, I've also given this presentation last year for KZN. I also gave it the previous year. The first year I ever did it was in 2021 when Asma asked me to do this presentation on identity politics for the Pietermaritzburg Debating League. So it's been a couple of years giving it, and I hope this time around it sticks much better with everyone because I don't think I've seen a lot of practical application of some of the things that we're discussing here. So I hope beyond just taking an interest in what I'm saying, you guys are able to apply it and think critically about it. A lot of the content here is also going to be covered in a quiz as well, because I want it to be stuff that sticks to your head. But without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, so 1 in 3 women will experience at least one form of sexual assault in their lifetime. Meaning, in developing countries, you are 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than you are to get a degree. 137 women are killed by a member of their family every day. 40 to 60% of women have experienced street-based sexual harassment. 241 Black people were murdered by the police in the United States in 2020 alone. There were 7,314 hate crimes against POCs, members of the LGBTQIA plus community, and disabled people in the USA just in 2019. 350 transgender people were murdered in 2020 in the Americas. What is the point of all these statistics? It's not a statistical overload. It is to establish a few important things. Firstly, that your identity heavily impacts the way in which the world treats you and the degree of safety that you have in this world. That is the first and primary thing that these statistics are meant to indicate. Secondly, it is meant to indicate something very valuable to you as young people and as debaters. It is that whenever you enter a debate or a conversation about identity politics, you are not entering your favorite topic or the fun topic. You are conversing about real things that have happened to real people with real impacts. So it is of absolute imperative importance that you treat their conversations, their ideas, and everything around them with the degree of respect that it deserves. So this is just basically giving you the idea of why identity politics is an important discussion for us to have. You can pause and read the slide if you want, but it is very much a summary of the conversation I just had with you. So, by definition, identity politics, also commonly referred to as politics of the identity or identity-based politics, is a phrase that is widely used in social sciences and humanities to describe the deployment of the category of identity as a tool to frame political claims, promote political ideologies, or stimulate and orientate social and political action, usually in a larger context of inequality or injustice, and with the aim of asserting group distinctiveness and belonging and gaining power and recognition. A lot of words. What do they mean? Identity politics essentially is making the assertion that your identity as a particular race, as a particular gender, or as a particular social group significantly influences your life, the way that you should engage with politics and the way you should engage with the world. That is at its most simple core, what identity politics is. Now, as much as I am giving this to you as a video that operates as a lesson, identity politics is not an absolute. It is not an economics. It is not a politics. It is which is weird, it's identity politics. But what I'm saying is it is not a set structure like a science that you can just study and take as fact. It is an idea, and a very debatable idea. It is a school of thought, a suggestion that your identity influences the way you should engage with politics. Therein, it is a very debatable idea. So for many people who are anti the idea of identity politics, they suggest that humans are multifaceted. They are people that have a variety of different things that influence how they impact or that influence how they interact with the world and how they interact with politics. Therefore, just basing it off of people's identity is an unreasonable, by identity I mean racial identity, gender identity, is an unreasonable and nonsensical thing to do. And it also creates the stereotypes that all people of a particular group are meant to act in a certain way. For example, all Black people are meant to vote for the Liberal Party and they're not meant to be conservatives. Same thing with women and other minorities. When we box those people in, it rewrites caricatures about them from the get-go. And I think that's a very legitimate stance to take against identity politics. I don't agree. I think that explanation, though, is very much mutually inclusive with what identity politics also suggests, but to each his own. And the pro-identity politics response to that is pointing out that as much as people are multifaceted, all of these aspects of their identity influence how they interact with the world, politics, the legal system, and everything in between. Cool. So what I want to get into are just some justifications that have been used for why oppression exists. The reason why I'm getting into this is not necessarily for debating purposes more than anything else. I hope that we're in a space that's progressive enough that a lot of these aren't used as arguments. But in the case where they are, I want you to, beyond just being upset and triggered, which you have every right to be, I want you to be equipped with the tools to be able to respond to these forms of logic when they're brought up. So the first one is pseudoscience. So this refers to scientific facts and research that are manipulated or misinterpreted to fit a particular view to justify the oppression of a group of people. Great example of this is social Darwinism. So Charles Darwin, in his book, The Origin of a Species, detailed his observations about the process of natural selection and speciation. So the general outline for natural selection was just suggesting that all species have genetic variation amongst their organisms, just due to normal gene mutation. And as time goes on, the ones that have suitable genes or suitable characteristics for that environment will survive, and the ones that don't have the suitable genes will die off due to their inability to utilize the environment the way it needs to be utilized. And the surviving organisms are selected by nature in order to live. In a second, we're going to figure out why the word nature is in all caps. And they will reproduce, leading to the entire population and species eventually having that gene. If you are doing NSC Life Sciences in grade 12, this is the textbook definition of evolution. So you can just copy paste when you're writing your exams. Yeah. But let's look at why this is not a very logical. So the way that this was misconstrued was that, and the idea itself seems fine. I think it's a very logical hypothesis that has been proven over and over again. But in politics, it's been misconstrued to suggest that organisms are more superior to others, and when we apply that to humanity, that means that some humans are inherently more superior and other humans are inherently inferior. So this served as the justification for apartheid and segregation in South Africa, because white South Africans believed that black people were less developed, and as such they were inferior to them. This is what we refer to as social Darwinism, and it's been applied all over the world, including places like Nazi Germany, to justify incredibly egregious acts. But this is a flawed logic, and it's a flawed logic for three primary reasons. Firstly, natural selection doesn't decide a criteria for who is superior and inferior. It simply suggests that some members of a particular species are more suited to certain environments than others. For example, people who live closer to the equator would have darker skin, which makes them more suitable to live in the area because of the extreme exposure, not extreme, but large exposure to the sun's rays. Whereas people who live further away from the equator, those would be people in Europe, maybe people in Asia, in a large portion of Northern Asia actually, may not have as much pigmentation because they don't need as much pigmentation because they live far away from the equator. So it suggests that different people or different members of a species are suited to their environment. It doesn't suggest that one person is more superior to the other. In fact, it suggests that in a different environment, those members of the species that die off might be better suited because of their genetic variation. So it doesn't suggest a hierarchy, it just suggests distinctions. Secondly, natural selection suggests that nature is the one that's doing the selection. So the number of available resources and the predators, which, mind you, I'm speaking about other species that are natural predators to that species. They are the ones that do selecting. It is not through like interspecies killing, it's not through murders, it's not through wars or the actions of individuals who deem themselves superior. Thirdly, natural selection was never applied to humans in Darwin's book, or it was never applied to a particular species of people. So when we start saying that there's that like level of hierarchy, then we start misinterpreting information that's already been provided. Now let's look at pseudoscience in reference to sexuality. So the simplest form here is to suggest that the way that the body or the human body was constructed was to reproduce between a male and a female through intercourse. And homosexuality, for that reason, is unnatural. But here are the problems with that argument. Firstly, sex isn't only for reproduction, it's also for the purpose of pleasure. That is the reason why women have a clitoris, for example. It is the reason why there are a lot of concentrated nerve endings in your glans penis. I can go on and on. It's the reason why there's a tug between your sympathetic and parasympathetic system, and there are hormones released in your brain that also allow for you to enjoy the process of sexual intercourse. And it's guys, there's a lot that goes into the pleasure of sexual intercourse biologically itself that suggests that it's not only for production, but it's also for pleasure and health purposes. So suggesting that just because we're not made to have babies and reproduce if it's sex between people of the same biological construct, it just doesn't make sense. Secondly, if you want to talk about nature and being natural, many other animals practice homosexuality, including giraffes, dolphins, and lions, so it's pretty natural. Thirdly, even if it was unnatural, there are many things in this world that are unnatural, but we still don't take issue with them. Medical practices are unnatural. You have an immune system. Why on earth are you taking additional medication to try to be better? Smoking isn't what your lungs are made for. In fact, it damages your lungs, but we still don't condemn them that they should die in hell. And like, your hair isn't meant to be cut. That's also not a natural thing. No one stones you for all of these things. Therefore, the argument to justify that against homosexuality becomes less sensible for all of those reasons. Then another one becomes religion, specifically for sexuality. And this is where people make mention of the fact that the Bible suggests that a man who is sexually involved with another man should be doomed to hell. Additionally, it features strong reservations against divorce and often states that women should be obedient to their husbands. The Quran also features many statements that can be interpreted as sexist. Now, I don't want to get into a very long debate about religion and whether or not it is actually homophobic and sexist towards women. But interesting enough with Christianity, a lot of firstly, just the concept of hell isn't mentioned in the Bible at all, so I don't know where people take that from. But secondly, a lot of these foundation or the quotes that homophobic pastors use in order to justify why the Bible says it's homophobic are stories, or they directly refer to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which they interpret as a story that's meant to teach you a lesson about homosexuality, when apart from the fact that it's very much interpreted, it could be interpreted in many different ways, it is literally a story that more closely refers to hospitality than condemning homosexuality. So I think the point that I'm trying to drive with this is religion isn't the most steadfast critic of all of these things because it is open to interpretation of the time. We can also say, yeah, it's open to interpretation given the time, but also people just use it to justify things that they believe in, as opposed to using it as a reference point sometimes to form their beliefs. So I don't know, it's a very controversial one. And yeah, you can make up your own decisions with respect to religion. Then let's look at economic necessity, because I think this one is a very interesting one. So this is when people suggest that the existence of slaves or the existence of poor people is a direct product of capitalism, because in order for an economy to be valid and in order for the rich people to essentially get rich, they have to have poor people who are able to do the labor for them. So when you create this clear division of labor, it means that the economy runs smoother. So having free labor is better than like trying to pay people. This was the main reason that was cited for slavery, for example, or the main reason why women were always meant to stay in the kitchen and were not given the opportunity to take over other jobs. Problem in this is that it just doesn't make sense. It's nonsensical. It's nonsensical because, number one, the main reason, it is. The main reason that was cited for the abolition of slavery was because it was actually low-key expensive. It's much cheaper, and again, unfortunately, much more exploitative, but it's much cheaper to not have to feed someone, not have them living in your house where you could have to create quarters for them, not have to provide them with healthcare when they are sick, but instead they do all of that for themselves and you just pay them less than half the amount of money you otherwise would have paid them, or you otherwise would have spent on them if they were just living on your land. So that was one of the real reasons why people agreed to abolishing slavery, for being honest. It wasn't because they started having a humanitarian heart. It just made more economic sense, which begs the question, if it always made more economic sense, what was the point of starting it in the first place? Because your economic justification no longer holds up. Secondly, when men started going to war in World War I, women took over a lot of those jobs, particularly in Britain, and that was what saved the economy from essentially collapsing. So then, how would it be more economical that women should stay in the kitchen when they literally proved that they are more valuable even in workplace scenarios? That stops making sense as a justification either now. So yeah, even economic necessity doesn't make sense as a justification. And I think by now you guys get my point, right? There is no real justification for oppression, right? For every justification that has ever been used, there is a clear, logical, and coherent counter argument for why it simply does not make sense at all, right? So, the justification behind who to oppress somehow manage to outweigh everything and make even less sense, because really race doesn't exist. It is the most arbitrary collection of physical attributes to define people that really aren't alike. You know what I mean? And here I give a nice example. Like, imagine if I decided to find a name and oppress every person with blue eyes, a second toe that's longer than their big toe, and an attached earlobe. I know right now to you it doesn't seem like it's the same thing, because through centuries we've been normalized to say that the texture of your hair and the color of your skin all are things that denote you belonging to a particular race and particular category. But think of how random of an association those things are. Just the same as just, people with blue eyes, a second toe that's longer than their big toe, and an attached earlobe. And gender doesn't really have a scientific background, sex does. So what I mean by that is the way that you are biologically constructed is very different from women belong in the kitchen. It's really not the same thing, because there's no reason biologically why a female necessarily needs to act in a certain way in society. These were all things that were simply manufactured. List could go on, but these are the two basic examples that I can give. So I think that, and I pose this because it's a question even I don't have an answer to at this rate, which is, if none of the reasons that I've given are the true reasons for oppression, then what is? I think that that becomes a better and, I suppose, greater conversation for you to ponder on. I think you should watch some interesting videos. There's a lot of philosophies around why this is the case. But yeah. Now I want to talk about something very important. I was just sipping my tea. I want to talk about how oppression was constructed, because the way in which oppression was constructed is something that you guys need to be conscious of, because as this video is being recorded, there's oppression that is being constructed even right now for a particular group of people, many groups of people actually. So it's important that you are aware of how it looks and how it operates. So when you construct oppression and you sustain it, it is through 6 elements. It is through political isolation, intellectual suppression, economic isolation, psychological debilitation, irreversible trauma, and contextual invalidation. Let's take a walk through each of these things and what they mean. First one is political isolation. So for political isolation, we speak about how minorities and marginalized groups are prohibited from voting, so they can't determine their own representation in the laws about their lives. They're also heavily dissociated from politics, so they have no education that's given to them regarding the intricate systems of government, which means that they never have sufficient information to vote. This trickles down to how things work even now in modern times. You'd find that a lot of Black South Africans are unaware of how our government is structured and what is the mandate of each wing of the government and each institution within the government. And often because of that, they don't know what is the difference between a municipal vote and a national vote, and they don't know the value of each and how they should go about weighing things up, because that political isolation and miseducation or lack thereof education is something that's been sustained through decades. And the result is that even when minorities have a right to vote, they often feel very dissociated from voting, because it was never something that was there on their priority list, much less was it something that was sold as important and valuable to them. So political isolation is initiated through structural means that remove minorities' ability to get education about politics and ability to participate in politics, and it is sustained through apathy of the same minorities, primarily because they still don't get that education and they aren't given the value proposition of engaging in politics. So, and even when education about politics is provided, it's generally insufficient to cover the generational knowledge and fully explain the necessary information. Then the consequence of this is that minorities, are not able to adequately hold the government accountable. This is an example of Black Americans repeatedly voting for Democrats even when they fail to deliver services, and blind ANC voting in South Africa despite the party being marred with corruption. It is because our understanding of our political system and how it should function and how we should vote is deeply broken from the get-go because of how the oppression was constructed. Then the secondary conversation becomes one about intellectual suppression. And I think this is a very, very important one as well. So this is when the government deliberately provides inferior education to marginalized groups to stunt their growth as intellectual bodies. So this includes women literally only being taught cooking, sewing, and cleaning as opposed to a wide variety of skills that were available to men. Legally, this looks like the Bantu Education Act that was sustained through leaders like Hendrik Verwoerd that deliberately taught Black people jobs that were at the very pits of the economic ladder, jobs that were meant to sustain their poverty. What that looks like is post 1994, even after liberation. I always like thinking about it this way. A woman who was only taught to be a maid has the 27th of April in 1994 off. They go and they vote. They go to bed. They wake up the next day. They have to go back to work as a maid. Nothing's changed. They still live in the same place. They still have the same level of education. Everything is still essentially the same because of the lack of education that was otherwise provided. And because of that, we'll have another conversation about the economic consequences of it. But the economic consequences of it is that that individual stays in the same cycle. For the next few years, they stay in the same kinds of jobs. They don't get re-educated. When they have children, their children also have limited opportunities because they are working from a particular reference point as well. That is how generationally something that happened years ago, like slavery, continues to have massive effects in modern times. Another important one is that the school facilities of minorities are extremely poor compared to those of the oppressor. I mean, as a coach, I always enjoyed hearing how you guys as students have choir, how you take music, you take Spanish as a subject, you take French as a subject. You have water sports. These are all things that were not available to me when I went to high school. These are all things that are not available to a majority of Black people when they go to high school. Obviously, those things enable you to participate in activities that you can leverage to get scholarships to go to certain universities. They allow you to participate in activities that independently can also allow you to earn a living. For example, if there's a rugby field in your school, you can start cultivating the sport so that you can be a famous rugby player in the future. That's something that a average to poor Black South African will never have the opportunity of because they never had those facilities. Then let's talk about economic isolation, which I speak about immediately after political isolation because I think the two are very much interlinked. In this situation, marginalized groups are relegated jobs with little to no intellectual prosperity, in accordance, obviously, to their educational qualifications, which is why I say they go hand in hand. And they're also given little to no education on financial management, which makes them even more exploited. Right now, and this used to be true even for my years in debating, economics was the least favorite subject by people from previously marginalized groups. So I used to always see the white people in the squad always run to do economics debates, but a lot of the Black individuals, Indian individuals that were around me were not particularly keen on doing economics debates. And that is because culturally and through our education sector, the education around how to manage money and how to deal with money on a macro scale has been constructed as attractive to a particular group of people who remain dominant in that economic space. And it's been made to seem like overly complex and difficult to understand for people who don't look like white people, essentially. Part of that is a part of the education to make it such that those minorities are unable to understand how the greater economic scale functions. They're also unable to understand how to manage their own money, right? Because if you don't understand how finances work, you don't understand how economics work, you don't understand why you're being given poor jobs, you will never understand what to do with your money in order to grow it in future, right? And as a consequence, even when Black people have a lot of money, or even when they come into money, it is often not spent on things that could influence their exponential growth, because systemically that education has always been lacking. So the result of this is, even in freedom, marginalized groups still have qualifications they obtained during oppression, so they can get the kind of jobs that they did then. Essentially, this means that they usually stay poor, and despite having the right to live anywhere, they remain in the same area. This means they are unable to send their kids to newer and better schools. They end up going to the same poor facilities, experiencing the same poverty, and obtain the same fleeting qualifications as their parents. And this is how oppression is sustained in the 21st century. All right. Then we speak about these next few factors, which I think are more interesting ones as well, which is, the first one here is psychological debilitation. And I don't think that this is recognized as much as it should be, which is that the political and economic consequences of oppression generally trickle down to psychological ones as well. This is where we are able to make minorities hate themselves by making the picture of correctness one that's closest to the oppressor. What this looks like is setting beauty standards that only are accepting of white women, as opposed to women who look like every other race. In modern times, it looks like expropriating the aspects of those other races and only celebrating them when you find them ever so present in white women, for example. It looked like the Marilyn Monroes in the 20th century. In modern times, it looks like Kim Kardashian being famous for looking a kind of way that many Black people look and are shaped, but they don't get the same credit for it. So the psychological aspect is to always make you hate yourself, because irrespective of how much you think you are beautiful or how much you think that you are doing things correctly, the closest image of correctness will always be whiteness, and you will always be incredibly distant from it. That's the first way. The second one is the erosion of the family structure, which sounds like something that's unrealistic. Ain't no way they're like invading family structures and whatever the case may be. But it's true. Think about how something like the Group Areas Act would work, right? It works in a particular kind of way that if a man wants to find work, he cannot work in the same community that he can live in a Black settlement. He has to go work in a town, a city, or a white settlement. Particularly, this applies for Black women who want to be maids or house workers. That means that often, in order for them to fulfill their job, they would have to live there, or they would have to live there because traveling from that white settlement to your Black settlement is just too far away for you to manage to do every day. What becomes the consequence of this? It means that we get many absent fathers in household situations, and when they return to those situations, reconstructing a relationship with their children becomes incredibly difficult. Because of the way that oppression also works, it means that your boss or your master has the ability to treat you as horribly as they want, because you are just meant to take it and smile and suck up to them, essentially. But when you go home, you externalize all of that anger that you have towards whatever situations you're in, where you feel inferior. For example, in the workplace, you try to exert your dominance in abusive measures when you enter the home space. This is what leads to, again, if not an absent and abusive father. The consequence is also an emotionally unavailable mother, because she is someone who has to take on the role of leading the house while simultaneously being subjected to the abuse from the patriarch of the house. It also means as a mother as well, you also suffer the same humiliation if you are going to work as a house worker, as a maid or a maid. So when you come home, you are unable to provide the kind of love or the kind of emotional availability that you want for your own kids, right? That becomes an erosion of the family structure. If not for that, it is Black men being killed in the streets regularly. And this is not something from 19 whatever. Black men still being killed in the streets of places like the USA in 2023. You know, when they are killed, it means that they are robbed of the opportunity to raise their children. The consequence is children who feel like they need to be the leaders of the household at a very early age. You're young, you don't have a high school diploma, you don't have anything. What are you going to do? You're going to engage in illegal activities in order for you to provide for the household the way that you think of it, right? As a consequence, you perpetuate the cycle of death. If you're not perpetuating the cycle of death, you are perpetuating the cycle of being an absent father, because the absence of your own father makes it difficult for you to understand what a father should even do, right? And in many ways, the way that oppression is structured leads to that erosion of the family structure, and it leads to all of these problems. Note, this is not an oversimplification of the problem. I understand that a lot of why Black families degenerate, or families in general, is complex, multi-layered, and there are multiple reasons to it. But oppression plays a significant role, and I don't think it's given as much importance. Another thing that links to what I've just discussed is the drug infestations. Now, it cannot be simultaneously true that, hold on, let me sip my tea. It cannot be simultaneously true that Black individuals were not given education and that Black individuals somehow managed to put together the chemical configurations and the nomenclature to construct things like cocaine and heroin, right? So logically, the reason why the projects or the Black communities are so filled with drugs is because the government institutions, or the people who are in charge of putting together the oppression, are the people who seeped those things into those communities to destroy them, right? And this is not some weirdo conspiracy theory. The South African government officials during apartheid were found to be responsible for introducing cocaine and crystal meth to various Black settlements in Gauteng. The FBI have played a hand in the introduction of cocaine in Black projects in the USA. These are all things that have been fact-checked and verified to be true. What is the purpose of this? When you take individuals who have suffered everything we've discussed, they're politically isolated, they aren't given education, they have severe mental illnesses, and then you, because of obviously the psychological debilitation, and you give them drugs, you are constructing a monster. It is easier to construct a monster that way, and we're going to talk about why the construction of that monster is important. Then from there, we enter a conversation about irreversible trauma. This is to add on and acts as a supplement to intellectual debilitation. So it is being exposed to consistent trauma in the form of witnessing violations occur to people like you very often, in the form of constant traumatic harassment of oppressive groups. It could take the form of rape and sexual harassment, sexual assault of women. It takes the form of seeing the violent reaction to protest, taking the form of seeing people around you massacred, like what's happening in modern times. It takes the form of people suffering undiagnosed PTSD, from violence that previously happened. It comes from family members dying in this process and the trauma that that gives you. If you pair all of those things up, you pair political isolation, where people seem as if they are unable to govern, but realistically they were just not given any education on politics and they were isolated from participating. You take economic suppression, where people are relegated to poor jobs and they are not educated on how to maneuver the economy. So then now they start looking like they are just lazy people who can't get jobs. Then you throw in, intellectual suppression, where, intellectual suppression, where their education is limited. Then they're made to look like they're stupid. You throw in the idea of irreversible trauma and just the mental health issues that are imposed onto these communities, then, and you throw in the drugs, of course, because the drugs are very important. Now they start looking like crazy monsters, right? So all of these forms of oppression become important in constructing the things that oppressors often want us to see, the things that oppressors often want us to be a part of. That's where we start seeing the stereotypes like angry black woman or the lazy black, or this girl has an attitude, she should smile more. And these problems are literally perpetuated through parenting, through community leaders, through authorities. These are things that construct the monster that makes oppression easy. But before then, remember, we need to sell this idea of this group, or we need to sell the idea of oppression before we go anywhere else. And the next slide is going to tell you how we can sell the idea. And that's through contextual invalidation. What this is when the oppressors create exceptions to the majority experience so they can use those exceptions to invalidate the real experiences that people have. So the example here is that the children of chiefs or other royal family members are given a superior education to other black people during apartheid, education that might be even equal to their white counterparts. This is often in exchange for chiefs keeping the system of oppression for black people and doing some of the oppression themselves, and crushing rebellion when it comes and being snitches and so forth, just being allies to the system. So for that, their children are given a superior education. When they're given that superior education, it means that they become success stories. Nelson Mandela and Albert Lutuli are examples of royals who got better education than most people. And then these people are used by the oppressors as an example of what minorities can achieve. In modern times, we have that now. The people who come up either through luck or through significantly better circumstances, and then minorities use them as an example for why it is possible to be a successful member of a minority. And when they do that, they make it seem easier, or they make you feel like you are the problem for not achieving success, or they shift it to be a conversation of personal responsibility as opposed to understanding the real problems that are arising from this. Cool. And then another very valuable thing that it does is that it makes minorities hate themselves because they start to believe these narratives as well. It makes it difficult for minorities to rally support from allies because the oppressors, they control the media, they control the narrative. And if they're able to push ideas of who's responsible for the place that specific minorities are in, then through being able to push that narrative, they're able to move support away from allies because it no longer seems like a problem with the system. It seems like a problem with the people. They are the ones that are lazy. They are the ones that don't want to do anything. And then from there, it just fosters hatred between the small percentage of successful minorities and the ones that suffer. In the form of modern times, it is your tone-deaf people who say racism doesn't exist because they are benefactors from the system. So that already manufactures infighting within these marginalized. Cool. So now we have broken down these people. We have made them into the monsters that are easy to dehumanize. We have made everyone believe that it is their fault that they are in the situation that they are in. Now people would be less apathetic to forms of oppression towards them because you've removed any and all aspects of humanity from that particular group of people. Let's look at a couple of examples of. Look at the construct of the nigger, right? So this, in characteristics, it's a criminal, drug addict, gives birth to crack babies, extremely lazy and relies on the government. They're angry, loud, and uneducated. And today, stuff like that is used to justify the mass incarceration of black men because they're criminals, remember? It's used to justify heavy policing of black neighborhoods because remember, they're drug addicts and they sell drugs. It's used to justify the police murders of black people because they are angry, loud, and just aggressive. It's used to justify economic exclusion of black people because they're uneducated, right? All of these things are problems manufactured by the oppressor, but it's much easier justifying, sustaining a lot of those problems when they're able to create these constructs. What's important to note is that these constructs that are created are shiftable. They change depending on what the oppressive system desires to do. We're going to look at it below. Cool. Here's what the Islamic community was from the 1930s to the 1990s. And I like using this image of Aladdin because a lot of Western media used to propagate the idea of the mystical nature of the Middle East. So they're very mystical and they're not knowledgeable people. They're slightly barbaric. I think that was a line from Arabian Nights in Aladdin. And they're just these magical and unreal people. Because of how magical, unreal, and hippie-like that people in the Middle East are, then we can just invade land and use the oil because, I mean, what are they going to do with it? I mean, they have like magic carpets and like all these random things. What are they going to do with the oil? We can also take ownership of and redistribute and govern land in the Middle East because, I mean, they're barbaric. What are they going to do with all of this? Still sipping my tea. Think about this image that was manufactured of the Islamic community during this time. Once you've done doing that, I want us to look at the image that exists now. It is a very violent, primitive thinking, barbaric individuals that are religious extremists, they are terrorists, and they are a threat to Western security. That's a very rapid change from what we saw earlier on. Why do we think this change needs to happen? This change needs to happen because they need a justification to sabotage elections, to invade Middle Eastern countries, to kill and bomb them, because remember, they are the terrorists. They are the ones that's creating the problem. We're just defending ourselves. In light of what's in the news right now, I think that is evidence that despite the fact that this PowerPoint was constructed 3 years ago, it remains as relevant today as it ever was, and it probably ever will be. And it justifies discriminating against Muslim people and banning them from traveling to your country because, oh, they're a security threat, right? They're going to bomb Western countries. The image changed because the form of oppression that needed to be given had also changed. Important thing to notice. I think oppression is a very complex thing. I also think it's a very well-constructed thing. I always say that the one thing I hate about oppressors is that they are incredibly intelligent individuals. They are just the smartest of smart people. Too bad they don't use that intelligence for things that matter. Quickly, I want to go through a couple of measures that exist for addressing oppression. I continue to sip the tea. There are three main approaches. There's a political approach, there's a social approach, and there's an economic approach. This is when I want to take the opportunity to say that what identity politics debate are not just philosophy or things, or you just saying things from the top of your head. It's important in identity politics debates to understand that it is a multi-sectorial thing. So if you're having a debate about identity politics, you're having a debate about economics, you're having a social debate, you're having a political debate. So it is a multi-sectorial thing. And if you don't involve those things, then you know that you're debating incorrectly. That I want to put out. So the political approach, simply put, it's referring to changing laws to be pro-marginalized groups and allowing them to have more freedoms, and then having more people in marginalized groups to be in positions of power. So it's changing things from a political. Here are some criticisms to that. So changing laws generally doesn't mean anything because in order for those laws to be meaningful, they have to be practiced by people on the ground level, where the oppression exists the most. And often that just simply is not the case. They just don't practice them. Secondly, it is that In order to truly access the freedoms set by the laws, the government needs to take an active stance in providing for marginalized groups. What that means is the right to freedom doesn't mean anything, or the right to live anywhere doesn't mean anything if I'm not given the tools to be able to live anywhere. So just creating a law doesn't mean everything. And then the third one is one that I'm going to discuss in more detail in the next slide, but it is the idea that having minorities in positions of power is often ineffective because the institutions that they're representing were constructed to be inherently against minorities. Let's look. So the reason why even minorities are in positions of power and the problems persist is, number one, their positions are governed by a code of conduct and a constitution that is constructed by people who do not look like them. So it is still very much a racist, homophobic, and sexist code of conduct and constitution that they have to abide by in order to govern, so they don't change their systems. Secondly, it is that their job descriptions force them to assimilate into the oppressor's habits and patterns. And an easier example of this is the idea that women in positions of leadership, particularly in large companies, have to suppress any signs of traditional femininity that they may want to express, and they have to be hard, stern, and emotionally unavailable in order for their male counterparts to take them seriously, or else they're going to say, you're too emotional, you're being a woman, you're not fit to lead. Third idea is that they have to inherit actions from their predecessor, right? So what I mean by this is that when an individual from a minority assumes a leadership position, they have to replicate the actions of their predecessor to keep the institution consistent so that public and investor buy-in remains the same. If there's rapid transformation, there could be unpredictable reactions from various people that could just make the institution go flat. That's why sometimes, even when a Black person is in a position of power, they sustain of corruption. I mean, there's sustain that element of oppression. Then there's also a workplace culture, because I think aside from the set rules that are there, there's a particular way that things work and function. And just because you're a minority, that doesn't change that culture. So when a Black police officer shadows their white superior and they see their treatment of Black people, they are likely to replicate that behavior either implicitly without recognizing it, or they may replicate it so that they can gain the favor of their superior, because they think, hey, if I show that I think like you, then that'll decrease my likelihood of being discriminated. And in that way, they're also able to assimilate into that profession's culture. Because remember, as a minority, you already stick out. So you try to do as much as possible to assimilate into that environment so you can feel like you belong. Then there's a conversation about minorities' pressure, which is that often when members of marginalized groups they are fearful of radically changing an institution they're in charge of, because they fear that if they harm it, they will close the door for other minorities to also assume that position of power. And as a consequence, they just keep the same problematic institution. And here's some things that really make you think about that point. The fact that Black Lives Matter was founded in the second term of the first Black president, and the fact that we've had a Black majority ruling party for, I believe, 29 years now. The Black community in South Africa still lives in poverty. That just shows you that who is in power doesn't change what the power system looks like. All right, cool. Let's look at the social approach. The social approach focuses on changing the minds of citizens to be more accepting of minority groups. This is through protest and demonstration, social discourse and education, creating safe spaces and support groups. The criticisms are that, firstly, there's no evidence that this is going to be effective. Often measuring the impact of a protest or how effective it is something that's difficult to do. But the biggest one is that it takes a lot of time to change. Like, to achieve a minute level of change, it takes a great deal of time. And that's an issue in today's fast-paced society. And then the third one is that it requires, hold on one sec, let me sip my tea. It is that it requires marginalized groups to convince their oppressors that they have worth, right? So if you're protesting for acceptance as a member of the LGBTQI community, you are in essence convincing straight individuals that you are a human and you deserve worth, which in and of itself is an insulting notion, that you have to convince someone who deliberately hurts you, abuses you, and desires to kill you that you deserve to live. And that is the problem with the social approach. Let's look at the economic approach, which is personally my favorite. I really like the economic approach because I'm a person who lives by the numbers. And this includes boycotts and strikes, sanctions, disinvestment, creating facilities to economically uplift marginalized groups. I think it's incredibly creative, incredibly effective in creating fast change, because it places pressure on the institution to change if it wants to even eat and survive. A great example here, the collapse of P.W. Botha's regime in South Africa. So basically, following the Sharpeville massacre and the Soweto uprising and the formation of the tricameral parliament, the USA passed bills sanctioning South Africa. There were many other sanctions that were put forward by many other organizations. You guys can read the entire case study, pause if you want to, or go to the specific slide. But it was effective in creating the collapse of P.W. Botha's regime and the reintroduction, when F.W. de Klerk joined, the main process that started was CODESA, which was intended to lead to the first democratic elections of South Africa, and successfully so, it did that. The economic approach is often the one that is most cited for the collapse of P.W. Botha's regime. Okay, now we're going to look at some models of freedom that are desired by members of marginalized groups. The first one is formal equality. Rest in peace, Chadwick Boseman. But everyone in formal equality is equal before the eyes of the law, and resources must be distributed to each person equally. So what this means is that the law is there, and according to the law, each person should have access to it. But there is no measures put in place to make sure that everyone has access to those things. Then there's substantive equality, which is the suggestion that people should be given the resources in accordance to how disadvantaged they are, so that everyone is equal as a result. And that's sort of what Killmonger suggests, but we'll get into something that represents Killmonger maybe a bit better in the next slides. But yeah, there's absolute freedom, which, I don't know, I like it. I like this one. I don't have any form of preference. But firstly, this idea rejects the idea of equality on 3 grounds. Firstly, that it is an unsustainable model. It is impossible to suggest that at all points in time there will be a world where everyone is equal to another, because human beings just inherently desire to be better. Secondly, it is the idea that as a formerly oppressed individual, your worth as a person is now placed on how your oppressor sees you. This goes back to a previous conversation I had on this video not so long ago, where I spoke about how you have to explain and justify yourself to the oppressor as to why you deserve to exist. And then the third one is that it is laughable to suggest that as a minority who's been through centuries of suffering, and you've worked tremendously to build the world, that you must now be viewed equally to individuals who have lived in privilege and have caused you the very pain and have been indifferent to that pain. Then the fourth one is just the fact that a perpetrator and a victim are not forced to live in the same house as equals. So then why should minorities and and people who are privileged be forced to do that? So based on this analysis, the belief is not concerned with the end result of trying to achieve equality. What it's essentially concerned with doing is freedom from oppression, right? The main aim is to be free from the oppression. Once you are free from oppression, then there's no concern about equality and how it works. In the form of Killmonger, he wanted to lead a revolution to break Black people away from the chains of oppression from all over the world to create a better world for the African diaspora. In the case of Malcolm X, he wanted to break Black people away from the shackles of oppression and establish a Black state, which I still think is a cool idea, but that is what absolute freedom kind of suggests. All right. I hope this was valuable to you, and I want you guys to kind of use this as a jumping point or a way to evaluate every marginalized group and how you should approach interactions about them and with them. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.